Congratulations on making it to the end of the jQuery part of the course. You've covered a huge amount of jQuery and hopefully wrote a great deal of code yourself. Now for the challenge, we're going to create a CodePlayer website, which is pretty much a copy of jsbin.com, which is a great website in itself that allows you to put HTML, CSS and JavaScript right there on the site and then run it to see how it looks. So it saves you having to collect it all together, and you can just run it there in the browser. So this is the demo of CodePlayer that I've put together. You can see that you can visualize the HTML and the result initially. And if you click on the CSS and JS, then you get to view the style sheets and the JavaScript as well. And you can toggle all of those and they go on and off as needed. So you can give yourself plenty of room to code. And then when you run the script, it then, you can see, has run the JavaScript there. It's just alerted the number 7. And it's also inserted a test div ID into what is actually an iframe over there. And it's applied the CSS with a bit of background styling there as well. So it's a reasonably advanced website, pretty complicated, but I think you can manage it. In fact, it doesn't use any techniques that you haven't covered yet, except for a very little bit in that very last step. So if you're feeling bold, I'd say pause the video now and try and create as much of this as you can. You should be able to create at the least the layout of the CodePlayer page, and you should be able to do a little bit of the functionality as well in terms of these toggles and the varying widths of the divs and the text areas which are in there. So pause the video now and do as much as you can, and then feel free to tune in and out as I explain the way that I would do it. Right, so we'll start from scratch, as we always do. Line up everything nicely. So I'll empty out this file here and get rid of all our styles. We don't need, we'll keep the jQuery. I don't think we're going to be using jQuery UI here, although you might want to. So we can get rid of those. So we'll just keep the jQuery. Right. So let's settle in. I'll just save that and refresh there. So there we've got our blank page. So first off, let's try and create this header area. So I'm going to create a wrapper div, which will contain the whole page. That's just something I do pretty much every website that I create. It's often very useful to have a wrapper div and just gives you a bit more control over everything. So let's create another div for the menu bar. We'll call it menu bar. Close the div there. And now let's bring in some styles. And add our menu bar. So we want our menu bar to be all the way across the site, so to have a width of 100%. We'll start with a height of, let's say, 40 pixels, and we'll see how that works out. And we'll have a background color. We want a kind of light grey, so I'm going to use my color picker, my Chrome plugin, and just choose a very light grey, maybe that one there. So E0, E0, E0. Great. Don't forget the hash. And the last thing we'll put there is a border at the bottom to just separate it out. It's going to be slightly darker, so we'll just use grey. Okay, Now that looks all right, but obviously we've got this issue around the edge here. So I think what we're going to need to do is set the margin and the padding of the body to 0. Great. So now we've got our basic layout at the top. So let's start putting in, first of all, our logo. So we'll call it a logo, even though it'll just be some plain text. So I'm going to call mine CodePlayer. You might want to use a different name for yours. Let's just see how that looks in itself. Yeah, looks fine. But I definitely want to play around with the font. I don't like the default. I'm going to show you a site that I use quite often when I want to get nice fonts. It's called Better Helvetica. It's just a quick CSS trick. And what it does, if I copy and paste this into my body, you'll remember that the font family attribute has values that it will take each font and try and apply that font if the system has it. And if it doesn't, then it will back off and try the next font, and on and on and on and on and on. So if you're on a Mac, generally speaking, you have the Helvetica Neue Light installed by default, whereas most Windows machines probably won't. So this will start off with what one might consider to be the nicest font, and then go simpler and simpler and simpler, and just end up with a sans serif one if there are no fonts at all on the system. So there we go. Now we've got this nice clean, thin font there. But we're going to want to change that a little bit. So let's add a bit of padding to the menu bar. Or actually, no, I'll think twice about that. I'll put it in the logo instead, because we might want to have different paddings for the central part of the menu bar and the button on the right. So let's try some padding at the top of 5 pixels. I'm not too bothered about the padding on the right or the bottom, but we definitely want some padding on the left. Let's say 20 pixels and see how that looks. Okay, not bad. We could definitely do with bolding it up a little bit, and we could probably increase the font size a touch. See how that looks. Nice. Okay, that's good enough. It's not a great logo, but it'll do the job for this site. Okay, so there's our logo. That's going to be on the left of the menu bar, so we're actually going to need to float that left. It's the only thing there at the moment, so it won't make any difference, but next we're going to bring in our button, which is going to be our run button, which we press whenever we want to run our code. So we'll create a button div to contain our button. And then within that, we want a button, and that will just say run. We'll give the button an ID, and we'll call it run button. There we go. Okay, fine. We definitely want it to be on the right. So let's get our button div and float it to the right. Great. And a little bit of padding would be useful. So let's try another 5 pixels on the top. And say 10 pixels on the right. Not worried about the bottom or the left. Okay, that's pretty nice. I think we want the text to be a little bit larger, so let's go for our run button and change the font size. Let's try 120%, see how that looks. Nice. Okay, I'll take that. I think that's a perfectly reasonable looking run button. And the last bit we want is the menu buttons in the middle to toggle the various bits on and off. So let's create an unordered list. We'll give it an ID of toggles, and this will be our set of toggles. So we'll have an li for HTML. I'll copy that down. One for CSS, one for JavaScript, and one for the result div. Okay, looks pretty awful, but we can sort that. So let's get our toggles URL in. So first of all, you'll notice that we've got an extra bit of padding there. That's down to the margin of the UL. So if we set that to 0, that'll sort that out. We want to get rid of the list styling. So list style to none. That'll get rid of those bullet points. And we definitely want to float everything left in the li, so that they're all on a single line. Great. So the only thing left, I think we want to center it. So let's give it a width of 200 pixels for now and a margin of 0 auto. Okay, it's looking good. Great. Now we definitely want to style that a little bit more though. So let's give them a bit of a border. And we'll need a height as well. So let's try 27 pixels, see what that does for us. Okay, we're looking better. Let's have a little look at the LIs and give them a bit of work. So we could do with a border right. To separate them out a little bit. Now, if we want that border to go all the way to the top, we actually want to remove the padding here, which will take them to the very top. And we also want to add in a bit of padding here instead. 5px there. Okay, that looks pretty nice actually. So we'll have 5px on the top and the bottom. Maybe we'll give them a bit more padding on the left and the right. See how that looks? A little too much padding. Okay, nice. So we definitely don't want that right border on the result function. So let's sneak in here and put in a style border none. Lovely. And let's finally remove all the padding from the UL so that we don't have that space on the left. Let's just move the whole thing down a little bit by giving it a relative position and top margin of 5 pixels. Great. It's looking pretty nice. So we've got our top bar. We'll worry about the actual toggling a little bit later on. We'll get all the styling sorted first, and then we'll bring in some JavaScript to do the work for us. So we're now outside of the menu bar. So let's bring in our first bit of code. So if we have a div, we're going to need several of these divs. So let's use class. So we'll have a class of code container. This is going to be our first chunk of code. And we'll give it an ID of HTML container. This is going to be the HTML one. Close that down. One thing we're going to need to do before that is break the floats, because we've got our left and right floats up there. We definitely want to have a div that breaks those for us. So we'll say clear both. Great. And then let's just make sure that hasn't messed anything up. Let's look at our code container class. And see what we want to do with that. So let's give it a background color for the moment so that we can see where it is. Blue. We want a height of, let's start with 100% for the moment, and a width of 50%. And we're going to want it to float left because we're going to have several of them, one after the other. And let's just put a little bit of content in there. Great. Okay, so we've got our 50% width. We haven't got our 100% height. Now we've got a slight problem with this actually. Because we've got our fixed div at the top, we actually want the height of this div not to be 100%, but to be 100% minus whatever that div is, whatever the height of that div is. There's a number of different ways to do that. You can do it with CSS, but I'm going to show you a way to do it with JavaScript. So let's get our script tags up and running. So if we want to set the height of the code container div to be equal to the height of the window minus the height of that top bar, or the menu bar, then we need to first work out what the height of the window is. Now, it's very easy to do that with JavaScript. We'll set up a variable called window height, and we use the string to get a bit of jQuery, and then we use the window to refer to the actual window, so the browser window. And we can use the height command to work out the height of that window. So let's just use an alert to see what that gives us. 66. So my browser window here is 626 pixels high. Now let's get the height of the menu bar. So this time we just select menu bar and we use height again, and let's have a quick look at what that is. Yikes. Sorry, that's because I've forgotten my brackets. Great, 40 pixels. Makes a lot more sense. Okay, so now we just want to set the height of the code container class to be equal to, in fact, let's create a new variable, code container height, and that's going to be equal to window height minus menu bar height. So we want to set the height to code container height, and we're going to need to add on pixels there because we need to specify the units of our height. Okay, great. You can see that works really nicely. It gives us the exact height that we want. Fantastic. Okay, so now we've got our code container. We're going to need to use a text area to put our code in. Let's just put some example code inside our text area for the moment. See how that looks. Okay, there it is. So let's style that a little bit. So code container text area. Let's set the width and the height to 100%. Great. And let's deal with the border. We'll set all the borders to none, but the right border can be 1px solid grey. Okay, that looks nice. And then we'll have all of those bits of code will work quite nicely. Great. Okay. There's our example code. Do we want to style that at all? I think maybe we could use a fixed width font would be nice. So let's have a font family of just a basic fixed width font is monotype. When you're coding, it's always nice to have a fixed width font, and then you can just see your code much easier. And maybe make it a little bit larger. Let's go for 120%, see how that looks. A little too large. A little too small. I think that's nice. And maybe a little bit of padding. Maybe a touch more. Okay. Great. The only other thing that we need is something telling us that this is the HTML bit. So I'm going to pop that here. We'll have a div tag with a class of code label and content of HTML. So if we have a look at that there, that's not exactly what we want. In fact, that does remind me that we could do with getting rid of our background blue. So we don't need that anymore either. Okay, but we want to put the HTML label over here. So we want to essentially float it on the right. So sorry, what was our class? Code label. Now we could try a float right there, but I'm not entirely happy with that, because then we'll have lots of floats all over the place, these floating lefts and that floating right. It would work fine, but I'm going to use a position instead. So I'm going to use an absolute positioning. Remember, absolute positioning takes it out of the flow of the page. So it will be positioned on top of other elements. There we go. And we'll set our margins. So we want it to be on the right. So we'll set a right margin of 10 pixels and a top margin of 10 pixels as well. Okay, that's great. Notice though that it's positioning it relative to the browser window. We want it to position it relative to our div. So if you remember, the way to do that is to give the container div, that is the code container in this case, a relative position. So if we change this to position relative, there we go. So that looks pretty nice. You can style that a little bit if you like, so we don't confuse it with the actual code there, but I'm going to leave it as it is because I think it looks perfectly pleasant. So there we've got our HTML. Now let's copy that div to make two more divs, which are going to be the CSS container and the JavaScript container. So we'll change the labels. And initially we don't want those to appear, so I'm going to add some CSS to simply set the display to none. And then, oops, something's gone wrong there. probably because I used small c's. Let's fix that. And JS container. Great. So we're back to how we were before, and we can bring the CSS and JS in later on. So our last one is going to be our result container. The label is going to be result, but this one, instead of a text area, it's going to have an iframe. And it's the iframe that we're going to put the result into. Now we need to sort that out a little bit. It's not looking great. We're only going to have a single iframe. So let's just refer to it as an iframe. So let's set the height to 100%. First of all, so that'll stretch it all the way down, and let's move it slightly to the right. Give it a margin of 10 pixels on the left, maybe a touch more to give it a kind of centered feel to it. Great. And I'm actually going to remove the border completely. You might rather keep in a border so that you can see what's going on, but I quite like the seamless look of having it completely melted into the page. Okay, so this is as far as I would hope you could get on your own, because we've now just created the look of the page. We've got our text areas and we've got our result iframe over here. So let's start by doing some toggling and making sure that when we click the CSS button over here, the CSS div appears. So first of all, we're going to want to give these LIs a class. We could possibly do without it, because they are the only LIs, but I think it's probably best to give them a class so that we can refer to them unambiguously. So, toggle. So what happens then when we click our toggle? Bring in a function. So first of all, let's sort out the styling of the actual buttons themselves. So we want them to go darker when they're clicked. So let's create a separate class for when they're selected. And initially we want HTML and the result to be selected. So we'll give them the class to start off with. And simply enough, we can just let the background color be grey. There we go. We have a slight issue there. Let's see if we can sort that out. Okay, let's just make sure, get that exactly right. Nice. Okay, great. So we've lost our extra bit of padding there. So going back to our JavaScript code, there's a new function that I'm going to teach you called toggle class. So when we've clicked on one of these, what we want to do is toggle whether or not the class of selected is applied to them. So if the selected class is applied, we want to de-apply it. And if it isn't applied, we want to apply it. So let's say how we do that. We're going to use the this command to select the particular li item that was clicked. And that's the toggle class command. And oops, we want to toggle the class of selected. So that does a really nice job of bringing in whether or not the buttons have been selected and clicked. Fantastic. Right. Now, we can also use a toggle command to toggle whether or not the larger divs are displaying. So let's see how we might do that. We need to work out which div to make appear or disappear depending on which button is clicked. So we're going to need to know which button is clicked. What we could do actually, I was thinking of giving these an ID, but quite cleverly, because the content of the actual LIs themselves, so HTML, CSS, JS, and result, if we change the IDs of the containers to be the same case as the actual content of the LIs, then we can create a variable, let's say new div. No, I don't like new div. Let's call it active div. So this is the div that we're working with at the moment, is going to be this dot HTML. And let's just check that that works. So alert active div. So when I click on JS, then it alerts JS. Click on CSS, it alerts CSS, etc. Okay. Let's not forget to capitalize the names of the divs up there. Great. So we can now toggle the div according to its ID. So let's get, for example, let's say we were going to click on HTML. Then we would want to toggle the HTML code container. So that would be HTML container. Like that. Toggle. And this toggle function again just makes it appear or disappear as necessary. So now if I click on HTML, I get that pop-up and HTML disappears. Let's just get rid of the alert command, we don't need that anymore. So HTML now appears and disappears very happily. That's great, but of course it's not going to be HTML every time, because at the moment it's always HTML that we're toggling. But what we can do is replace HTML with the variable active div, because that will be the text of the actual LI itself. And so if I click on result, then this will select the result container. So now, if I click on result, that disappears or reappears. I can do the same with JS, CSS, etc., etc. Now you're noticing, of course, that our problem is the width stays at 50%, and we don't want that. We need to make the width, if all four of them are going to appear, we need to have the width as being 25%. So it's important that we know how many divs are currently active and then set their widths accordingly. Fortunately, there's a great jQuery function called filter that we can use to do this. So let's show you how it works. let's have a variable called showing divs. And what we're going to do, we're going to loop through all of the divs with a class of code container. So code container. And we're going to filter them according to a particular function. And that function is going to return if the CSS of that particular div has a display value of none or not. So we want to know whether or not the display value is none or something else, i.e. showing or not showing. So we use this again, and CSS display none. Nope. CSS display, and we want to know whether or not that is equal to none. Great, so this little function will return true if the display of this particular div is not equal to none. So essentially it will return true if this div is displaying, is showing, which is exactly what we want. Okay, great. The last thing we need to do is set our function to work out the length of that little array that this is going to create. And essentially this will then give us the number of active divs, or the displaying divs, out of all of the code container divs. So it's quite a useful little function, useful little trick. Let's just check that it's working. So if I do that, we get 3, brilliant. If I do that, we get 4, etc. Fantastic. So we've got our showing divs. So now we just need to calculate the width that we need depending on how many divs are showing. So let's create a variable, we'll call it width. That's going to be equal to 100 for 100% divided by the number of showing divs. So if showing divs is 2, then we want 50% each. If it's 3, we want 33.33% each. And if it's 4, then we want 25% each. And then all we need to do is set our code containers to have a width of width plus %. Great, see how that works. Excellent, so we'll bring in JavaScript. Great, so this is working really well. You can see there's one problem there. We're not getting the borders showing of the CSS boxes. This is because we've got issues with overlapping here caused by padding and widths going to over 100% of the width. Now there's a nice easy way to fix that, and that is to use the box sizing attribute and set it equal to border box. Just see what effect that has. Everything displays now really nicely. What that essentially does is it includes the border in the width of the box and padding as well. So you don't get these problems of padding adding to the width of an already 100% wide element. So that can be a really useful trick if you find yourself running into this problem. Okay, so if we now have a look, we're pretty close. We've got our elements updating and toggling very nicely. We can update the example code in each of those three. So the one thing that we need to do is actually make the code player work. We need to run the code in the iframe. So we're going to do that when the run button is clicked. Our run button had an ID of run button, very sensible. So let's select that and run a function when it's clicked. Okay, so what we're going to want to do when the run button is clicked is fill the iframe contents with the values of, let's start for the moment with HTML and CSS, and we'll worry about the JavaScript later. Now, this is something that you haven't seen before, but it's reasonably straightforward. We select the iframe, as we normally would, and then we use the contents function, like that, to find or to search within the contents of the iframe. And then we use the find function to find the tag with the value of HTML. And then we want to set the HTML of that tag. For now, let's just do a test. Let's do one step at a time and change the value of the HTML in the HTML tag in the contents of the iframe to test. Just see if that works. Great. Okay, so we've changed the contents of our iframe. Obviously, we don't generally want to change them to test. We want to change them to whatever is in the HTML section of the divs. So let's set the text area for this one to have an ID of HTML code. While we're here, we'll do CSS code as well and JavaScript code. Great, and then instead of test, we want to have the HTML code dot val. Great, okay, let's run that. Brilliant. So we're displaying the example code in our iframe. Nice. Now we need to get the CSS in there as well. So that's reasonably straightforward. All we do is open a script tag in the HTML, and then we're going to add our CSS to that. So our CSS has an ID of CSS code .val. So I'm going to open a style tag. There we go. Notice I'm using single quotes for my style tag so that it doesn't get confused with the double quotes that we're using to identify our elements. So after the style tag, I want to put the contents of the CSS code text area. Val there, and then I want to end the style tag, and then I want to put the HTML. So just before we test that out, let's just change the CSS code to something that will actually make a difference. So I'm going to set the background of the HTML, the background color, to blue. Okay, see how that works? That looks great. Okay, so we've got our HTML in there, we've got our styles in there. The only thing that we need to do now is our JavaScript. Now, there are various issues with running JavaScript that users are allowed to enter, and I'm not going to go into those issues now. They're pretty complicated. Generally, they're big security issues. So you don't want to just allow users to run arbitrary JavaScript on your site, because they, in theory, then can access some files and access scripts on your server. So you don't want to allow that. But for this, because we're just running it offline, we'll do it in a very simple way. and you can check out the security implications yourself. I won't go into those here. So there's a very simple way to evaluate JavaScript. And again, it's a bit of a dangerous function, but we'll deal with it for now because we're just running this offline. And simply, there's a command called eval. And so if I want to evaluate the JavaScript in the JS code text area, I just select JS code.val, put that inside my eval statement, and let's change the JavaScript code to something that will actually work. Like that. Now if we run that, that runs the JavaScript as well. Brilliant. Now, one slight thing that we just need to finish off to make the whole thing work nicely is that at the moment, the JavaScript is not actually being run in the iframe. So if I do an alert, that's fine because we don't notice which frame the alert's being done in. But if I tried to run something which required access to the HTML or the CSS which is contained within the iframe, then that's not going to work. So I need to actually run the JavaScript in the iframe. And to do that, I need to actually use good old JavaScript to select my iframe. So I'm going to need an ID for the iframe. We'll call it result frame. And then we use document.getElement by ID. Remember that? Result frame. We use a function called content window to access the content of the iframe. And then we do our eval within the content window. And now we can just test that out. So we still get our nice JavaScript alert. Let's just make sure that that is happening inside the window. How can we do that? Well, let's just run some JavaScript which will only work within the window. So let's have a div with an ID of test. Okay, so that's going to be our example code over here. And then we're going to use our JavaScript to set the HTML of that test div to be something, and then we'll know that it's working within that iframe. So we'll have document.getElement, getElement by ID test. Remember how to do this? In our HTML, remember that, equals, it's working. Okay, let's take a look, run, it's working, fantastic. So we've got HTML being put into this iframe, we've got CSS being applied to that HTML, and then we've got the JavaScript actually running on that HTML. So fantastic. If you've managed to recreate this yourself, then congratulations. Not an easy website at all. If you've played around with it and you've created something that looks a bit different or works in a slightly different way, then that's great. Please upload it to the servers and show us a link in the forum so we can take a look. Please do, however, remove the eval option from the JavaScript, because you are putting yourself a little bit in danger and allowing people to potentially access your server. So if you're going to upload it somewhere, remove the eval so it's only the HTML and the CSS that's working, not the JavaScript.